everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Man, a very busy day on Capitol Hill. Pete Hegseth returned to the Hill to see if he can preserve what looks to be an embattled and long-shot bid to become President-elect Trump's Secretary of Defense. Doing what you do in times like this, you meet individually with senators. The former Fox News host also engaged with reporters. We'll have some of that sound a little bit later in the show. Hegseth, as you might have heard, has been variously accused of alcohol abuse, sexual misconduct, and mismanaging money when he ran a veterans nonprofit. Importantly, Hegseth has denied all allegations of wrongdoing. Also on the Hill, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, the head of President-elect Trump's soon-to-be-created White House-adjacent Department of Government Efficiency, talking with lawmakers about how they might make proposals, which of course Congress would have to agree to slash the size and scope of the federal government. And after weeks at Mar-a-Lago dealing with transition details, President-elect is in New York City tonight to accept an award from his friends at Fox Nation. The award, Patriot of the Year. I want to start tonight with Scott MacFarlane and Nicole Killian. Scott is on Capitol Hill. Nicole is in New York, traveling with President-elect Trump. Scott, let's talk about Pete Hegseth and what we have learned today.
This is a fourth day in a row he's been canvassing the Capitol, doing the thing you're supposed to do. You go to the senators, try to sell yourself and sell your candidacy and secure those precious nomination confirmation votes. He is still meeting largely, if not exclusively, with the most loyal of Trump's Republican allies here at the U.S. Senate, talking to them behind closed doors and coming out and occasionally answering questions about the future of this effort to become the nation's top military official, the defense secretary. We asked Pete Hegseth if he thinks he's gaining ground or losing ground. He didn't want to answer that question. But we also asked, late this afternoon, Major, how much he's being pressed in these meetings about these allegations of alcohol misuse. Take a listen to our exchange.
How many of the senators have pressed you on the issue of alcohol?
Oh, we've had great conversations about who I am and what I believe, and frankly, the man I am today, because of my faith in my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and my incredible wife, Jenny, right here. I'm a different man than I was years ago, and that's a redemption story that I think a lot of Americans appreciate.
Let's get back to the basic math, though, Major. Need 50 votes to win a confirmation. Got to have 50 Republicans, likely in this case. No Democrats have expressed any support for Pete Hegseth. So the rubber hits the road when he starts meeting with those who have defied Donald Trump in the past. Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska have a history of defying Donald Trump. And a lot of eyes are focused on John Curtis of Utah, the senator-elect who will succeed Mitt Romney. Considered a potential moderate pivotal vote on all these nominations. We brought questions about Pete Hegseth to him late today. Take a listen to that. Any thoughts yet on Pete Hegseth, or is given it some thought?
So I've not met Pete. Look forward to meeting with him. I've of course read what's in the news. I'd like to hear from himself.
Troubled by what you hear in the news?
Well, I think everybody's got concerns with what's in the news, but I think he deserves a chance to respond, and I look forward to meeting with him.
Major, just not hearing any unequivocal support or commitments from any of these potential swing Republican votes.
And Scott, I want to play for you sound from Fox News earlier today from Iowa Senator Joni Ernst, illustrating what you just described. Meeting, acknowledging, but not committing. Let's listen to that sound.
Will you support his nomination?
Well, I did have a very long, lengthy discussion with Pete yesterday, and I do appreciate his service to the nation. I also am a combat veteran. So we talked about a number of those issues, and we will continue with the vetting process. I think that that is incredibly important.
It's not a kiss of death, Scott, but we will continue with the vetting process is not exactly a thumbs up.
I think that was the most telling thing said today about Pete Hegseth. These interviews done in the hallway are a dime a dozen. We do many of them every day. They're unscripted, they're unannounced. Sometimes the answers are a little bit mushy. Senator Ernst knew that question was coming and allowed herself to be booked onto Fox News and its enormous audience inside the party to make an equivocating statement about Pete Hegseth. That may ring louder than anything else said inside the marble hallways today.
Nicole, I want to bring you into this conversation from the perspective, as best you can gather it, from the Trump transition about Pete Hegseth's prospects and where President-elect Trump stands in relationship to those prospects and his advocacy.
Well, I think they're certainly taking a wait-and-see approach. I mean, obviously also being on the Hill earlier this week and talking almost daily with Pete Hegseth, you know, he told me that he speaks to the president-elect pretty regularly and said that he spoke with him most recently and that the president-elect encouraged him to keep going, that he was behind him. That being said, we also have reporting that his team is looking at other alternatives, whether that is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis or others. Joni Ernst's name, for that matter, has been floated as well, although when I asked her yesterday whether or not she was under consideration, she said strictly Mr. Hegseth is the nominee. So there are a lot of moving parts here. I mean, I think as we all know, this always comes down to a numbers game. Part of the reason why we saw Matt Gaetz drop out from being the Attorney General designate was he just didn't have the votes. So as Pete Hegseth is up there on Capitol Hill meeting with senator after senator, you know, they're trying to get a read on whether or not those votes are there. The president-elect very much interested in whether those votes are there. And I think ultimately that will determine whether Hegseth stays in or goes.
And Nicole, is it your sense that the Trump transition is going to let Hegseth fight this out largely on his terms and according to his strategy and his own advocacy, meaning the president-elect is not going to use, at least he hasn't yet, and may not use his megaphone to advocate for senators to get in line?
Yeah, well, again, I think we'll have to wait and see, but certainly Hegseth has made clear that he is not backing down, that he is a fighter, that he is a warrior, and he's going to ride this out as long as he can. So, again, we'll have to see how far that goes in terms of swaying any potential senators. I can say time and again when I have asked him and his team whether or not they have the votes, they will not say. And that's probably to be expected. But, you know, they continue to make the case that, hey, we're meeting with senators, we're going through the process, we're doing what we need to do. But again, you know, for the president-elect, he obviously has a close relationship with Pete Hegseth, wants him to be successful, but again, I think is also realistic about his potential prospects. And so that's why he, too, has to potentially keep his options open.
As Scott McFarland and Nicole Killian know, when it comes to confirmation fights, when you are confident, you speak confidently. When you are not so confident, you speak elliptically. Nicole and Scott, thank you very much. Later this hour, Pete Hegseth's attorney, Tim Parlatore, joins us to discuss the state of his nomination and related matters. In addition to politics, we are following new developments in the gunning down of United Healthcare CEO in Midtown Manhattan yesterday morning. Newly released surveillance photos show the person police say they want to question. And we want to warn you, the video you're about to see is disturbing. He is believed to be the man who shot Brian Thompson outside the Hilton Hotel, again, very early yesterday morning. We are also learning that the words deny, defend, and depose were found written carefully on a live round and a shell casing that police discovered at the scene. Anna Schechter has been following every development in this story for CBS News. She, of course, is our senior coordinating producer for crime and public safety. Anna, catch us up on the latest.
Well, the latest is we have details on the murder weapon. It's a B&T Station 6 gun. You saw there in the video, it's an unusual looking gun. It's got a very long barrel there. And in that video, you see him have to kind of cock the gun before each time he fired. He fired multiple rounds, seemingly in cold blood, stayed calm throughout. So that's interesting about the gun. And we know that investigators have been up in Connecticut last night looking for the place of purchase. So that's new details that CBS News can report. We also know that the man that we see in those photos taken at a hostel where you see his face, you see him smiling in one of the photos you showed during the introduction, that person who is wanted for questioning checked into that hostel with a fake New Jersey ID, and investigators believe it's just a made-up name. It's not an ID for anybody else. They didn't get any hits on that name, and that he likely paid in cash to cover his tracks. So we're starting to really piece together a picture, but we are now coming up on 36 hours after this murder. And so as time progresses, investigators are getting more and more anxious. They want to solve this thing. And New Yorkers, meanwhile, are staying pretty cool, going about business as usual. But 36 hours, I think a lot of people thought that we would at least have a name by now. Major?
And what do we know about the person that police want to speak to's departure from the murder scene?
Well, it's a great question. You see in the video him calmly cross the street. He went around back behind an alley and picked up a bicycle, rode north into Central Park, and that actually created some problems because there aren't as many cameras in Central Park. But within a few hours, investigators were going to businesses along Central Park West and on West 85th Street. The owner of the building on that corner had a Google camera, surveillance camera, attached to the side of the building, and you clearly see the shooter riding a bicycle without the backpack moving west. And that is the last known image that we have of the shooter. So we are following our reporting that investigators have been looking north of the city, outside the city. We know they stopped Long Island Railroad trains last night. They cased at least one New York City area airport, and they came up with nothing. And that's what we know so far.
And the manhunt, quite obviously, continues. Anna Schechter, thank you very much for all of those important and breaking details. On Capitol Hill, Republicans will, as you have probably heard, control both chambers of Congress. But their House majority, as you've also probably heard, is going to be very, very thin, almost historically thin. Question, how will this impact House Speaker Mike Johnson's legislative ambitions? Next, our congressional reporter panel weighs in. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. It's great to have you with us. Republicans have said with some frequency that November's election gave President-elect Trump a mandate. But could their small House majority hamper that legislative agenda? Speaker Mike Johnson currently has a 5-seat majority. That does not account for several House Republicans who have been tapped for administration positions. Andrew Desiderio and Daniela Diaz join us now. Andrew is a senior congressional reporter at Punchbowl News. Daniela covers the same beat for Politico. So, Andrew, I'll start with you. Assess what Speaker Johnson and the House Republican leadership are walking into in the next Congress and how thin, historically, that margin is going to be.
Yeah, it's going to be razor thin. I think the thing to think about first is the fact that Donald Trump has picked so many sitting House members for both his cabinet as well as, in the case of Congressman Mike Waltz, a White House staff position, being National Security Advisor, which is not subject to Senate confirmation, of course, but still he has to at some point vacate that House seat. And by the time those special elections all play out, it's going to be a few months before those seats are filled. Yes, they will be filled with Republicans because those are, in almost all of those cases, red, very red districts, but it's going to take a while. So for at least the first couple of months, when Republicans have some pretty ambitious agenda items on their plate, it's going to be really difficult to get really anything through the House of Representatives in particular.
And Daniela, how is this, what Andrew just described, which everyone can see, shaping, if at all, the lame duck agenda? Because I would think it would be in the best interest of the House Republican leadership now to clear up as many matters as they could in this lame duck session so as not to carry them over into the early part of the new Congress. But as I hear it, that may not be happening.
That's exactly correct. I mean, you'd think that Speaker Johnson would be putting legislation on the floor and trying to move things quickly, and that's just not the case. But remember, this is also a small majority. He really is dealing with just 2 seats, really, that he can play with right now. Next Congress, it'll be even less. So Speaker Johnson is aware that he really, really will have to work with all the factions of the conference to be able to move any legislation. And just adding to what Andrew excellently put, I believe there's going to be a lot of legislation moving early January, before January 20th, when those members are, appointed to their seats, whether they're confirmed or not. Mike Waltz, Stefanik, that is what we're going to expect from Speaker Mike Johnson, considering that he will have those seats filled at that moment. And after that, it's going to be really taxing for him to move any legislation.
Right, so January 3rd to January 20th could be a very active period for the House Republican majority. I want to play you both some sound from a hearing on Capitol Hill today about continued U.S. Secret Service reckoning with the assassination attempt on then-candidate Trump's life in Butler, Pennsylvania, and this sort of explosive exchange between Pat Fallon, member of Congress, Republican from Texas, and the acting U.S. Secret Service Director, Ronald Rowe. Let's listen.
Do not invoke 9/11 for political purposes.
Oh, I'm not. I'm invoking this.
You are, sir.
Gentlemen,
And you are out of line.
I would like to ask him a question.
I actually responded to Ground Zero. I was there going through the ashes of the World Trade Center. I was there at Fresh Kills.
I'm not asking you that. I'm asking you,
Congressman.
Were you the special agent in charge?
To show respect
You were not.
for a Secret
That's
Service
a bunch of
member
horse hockey.
that died on 9/11.
Oh, that you're trying to be.
Do not invoke 9/11 for political purposes.
Oh, I'm not.
So the laziest question that can be asked in Washington is, what do you make of that? But I will ask you both, were you surprised by the sort of depth and breadth of the venom in that exchange and how it sort of was a sidecar to the actual oversight questions of the hearing, which is what lessons have been learned and what remedies will be applied in the future? Andrew, I'll start with you.
Yeah, look, I think it's a reflection of the anger that members on both sides of the aisle have felt in the months since the first assassination attempt against Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, as well as the assassination attempt on his golf course in Palm Beach, of course, that was more recently. I will say that something the acting director mentioned, I think, resonates with a lot of members up here, which is that he wants to put the secret back in Secret Service. In other words, he doesn't want this to be an agency that people are talking about all the time. And that's an understandable desire, obviously, but given sort of the magnitude of what happened and how, again, members in both parties are searching for answers about this, it shouldn't be surprising that we're talking about the Secret Service like this and that they're being hauled in front of Congress.
And Daniela, this is the time as the Congress winds down for farewell speeches. Joe Manchin gave his on the Senate floor. He was, of course, a Democrat for most of his career in the Senate, then at the very tail end became a registered independent. Let's listen to Senator Manchin.
Each side could take a little step to find common ground, powerful things happen. But with the successes, I've seen more than my share of missed opportunities. Legislation that was overwhelmingly supported by the American public, bills that would have significantly improved the lives of millions of Americans, immigration reform, background checks for guns, balancing the budget. Too many opportunities to fix what's broken in America that has slipped right through our fingers.
Daniela, the land of missed opportunities, I guess.
He is really speaking, and so was Romney in his farewell speech, of just how they weren't able to really pass a lot of bipartisan work. They are seen as some of the last bipartisan lawmakers that are now leaving due to the partisanship on Capitol Hill. And it's going to be really interesting what next Congress is going to look like, considering there is a Republican trifecta. Trump is back in office and, of course, is not completely eager to work with Democrats on any sort of issues. So we're already seeing that from Republicans who are trying to figure out ways on how they're going to pass legislation, not needing any Democratic support. And I believe that's really a taste of what to expect these next 2 years once the new Congress comes in.
The key words there, reconciliation. That is a process to move significant legislation with financial implications on a straight party line vote if you have the votes and you so choose. Reconciliation, that's going to be a big part of the conversation early next year. Andrew Desiderio and Daniela Diaz, thank you very much for your time. Pete Hegseth is refusing to veer off what's become an increasingly tough path to his Senate confirmation. The attorney who represents Trump's embattled pick to lead the Department of Defense joins us next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Pete Hegseth is continuing to make his case one by one to senators on Capitol Hill, denying allegations of financial and sexual misconduct as well as alcohol abuse. His attorney, Tim Parlatore, joins me now. Tim, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
You have counseled us in the media to quote directly from your client, Pete Hegseth.
Sure.
So let's start with something he said to reporters on Capitol Hill this afternoon. As long as Donald Trump wants me in this fight, I'm going to be standing right here in this fight. Is there any indication that you or your client have that Donald Trump, the president-elect of the United States, is wavering at all in his support for Pete Hegseth?
Not at all. All of my client's conversations with the president, he's been very positive, very supportive. And so, really this is, going to, people that are saying, oh, is Pete going to drop out? Is he going to, change his mind? The answer is no. He is in this until the end. And so as long as he has the support of the president of the United States elect, which he certainly has right now, he's going to continue. And he expects to go forward to the confirmation process and be confirmed.
How does Pete evaluate conversations about Ron DeSantis, Joni Ernst, Bill Hagerty, other names that have been surfaced as possible replacements?
That's not something that we're really concerned about. I mean, that's a lot of, again, anonymous sourcing saying that these are alternatives. But, Pete is focused on his nomination, and he's focused on going to each one of these senators, answering their questions very directly. And as long as he can keep going out there and earning every single vote from each individual senator, all of these other, possible replacements are irrelevant.
When senators speak to reporters and don't affirmatively say they're prepared at this moment to support Pete Hegseth, does that give you cause for alarm?
I don't think so, because really what Pete wants more than anything else is to have a full and fair hearing. And as long as he is afforded that full and fair hearing, he's expecting that he'll be able to get the votes at the end of that. He certainly is going around it. Part of the problem is, as you've seen over the past week, we've had a constant, trickle of these, stories that come out, anonymous claims, all false. But as these things come out, I understand that the senators want to hear answers, direct answers on each one of these issues. And so that's what we're doing right now. And so, yeah, the fact that the senators are not saying yes yet, they have an open mind. They're not saying no. They're still listening. So, we're happy to keep talking to them.
You're still in the game, in other words.
Absolutely.
Pete Hegseth also told reporters today, I'm a different man than I was years ago, describing it as a redemption story.
Yes.
Redemption from what?
That's, to me, one of the pieces that's gotten lost from this. Pete was a young Army officer. He deployed. He was in combat. He transitioned from that into civilian life. And, when you strip away all of the fake allegations, at its core, what these stories are, he ran a couple of veterans organizations where a bunch of young combat veterans got together, and after these events, they had occasionally too much to drink. And you know what? That's not unique to Pete Hegseth. That's something that a lot of us went through. I went through, okay? When I got out of the Navy, I drank too much too. And, Pete and I and others overcame that. We're talking about things that happened when he was in his early 30s. He's overcome that, and he has grown from that. But I think that what that does is it gives him a far greater perspective than anybody else, than any of these past secretaries of defense. He understands what the men and women that he's about to lead in the Pentagon are going through, what they need, the support that they need, and the stresses that they face, better than any of these other people that just sit there in the ivory tower and pass judgment on anybody that's not zero defect.
Is part of that redemption story that he was once an abuser of women or a predator toward women?
Absolutely not. Again, when you strip away the false claims, what you have is a veteran who found solace in the bottle occasionally. All of this abuse of women, that's not true. That's
and he
false.
Does not have a drinking problem now.
He does not have a drinking problem.
Then why vow to senators that have confirmed he would not drink?
That is a statement that he is taking, and this was something that he vowed before any of these news reports came out. He considers this job to be like a deployment, where you have to be ready 24/7. When you're on deployment in Iraq, you don't know when something's going to happen in the middle of the night, if the enemy is going to mortar your base. So you always need to be ready, even when you're asleep, to be able to get up and immediately move. As the Secretary of Defense, he doesn't know what Russia or China or who's going to do something in the middle of the night. And so at no time does he want to be anything except 100% mentally acute.
There's a report about an episode in 2017 in Monterey. There were no charges.
Correct.
That's absolutely fair to point out.
Yes.
But an NDA was signed and a payment was made. That was in the context of his employment at Fox.
Correct.
He's now in a much more important position, as you just described.
Yes.
For the benefit of the Senate and for the benefit of the public, would your client be prepared to release the woman involved from that NDA and allow her to testify or reveal what she makes of that episode for the benefit of the Senate and the public?
That's a great question. So first of all, I want to correct something here. It's not an NDA. It's a confidential settlement, which includes confidentiality on both parts. This woman, through her friend, violated that confidential settlement agreement, and that is why we have been speaking out about it. Okay, the settlement at this point has no force and effect. That is the reason why I've been speaking about it, why my client's been able to speak about it, because prior to her violation of the agreement, that confidentiality also prevented Pete Hegseth from talking about everything she did that night. So there is no legal restriction on her being able to come out and tell her story. However, I will warn you, if she comes out and tells the truth, then everybody's going to say, wow, this never happened. If she comes out and lies, she's going to be subject to a pretty stiff lawsuit for defamation. And so I think that is the reason why, even though she knows, I sent her lawyer a notice that agreement is now null and void. And she has been declining interviews because for her to repeat the same lies would bring her directly into a courthouse and liable for defamation.
You recently implied this was extortion.
I did, absolutely.
Was it?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. This is a situation. It was investigated by the police. I'm happy to go through the facts with you and show why he was exonerated in this situation. They came to us and they demanded payment, or they were going to make these allegations public through a lawsuit, which even though that lawsuit had no chance of winning, had we taken that thing to a trial, I would have absolutely slaughtered them. But the mere allegation that a Fox News host had drugged and raped a woman, Fox News or CBS or CNN, no network is going to sit there and wait for 2 years. When one of your hosts is accused of that, they'd be well within their rights to say, okay, Pete, we can't have you on TV now, so we're going to let you go. He would have lost his reputation, he would have lost his job, and nobody would have cared that 2 years later in a courtroom we would have won, because his life would have already been destroyed. That is unfortunately one of the facts of life of people who have a public position, that people do come and they do this type of extortion. They do it, through a legal process occasionally. And yes, people do settle these kind of claims to protect their reputation and their employment. And that's what we did here.
Tim Parlatore, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
From Trump ally to critic and back again. Some Republicans fall into that category. Specifically, we're referring to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Next, our political strategist will explain his reemergence or possible reemergence in the Trump inner circle. You're watching America Decides.
I don't know what goes into paying hush money to a porn star to secure silence over some type of alleged affair. I can't speak to that.
Politicians love not to speak to something they're speaking about. They do it all the time. In that case was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis on Donald Trump's hush money scandal said during the Republican primary. Now, things have been patched up and might even be so patched up that Governor DeSantis is in the mix should, very important word, should Pete Hegseth withdraw as President-elect Trump's pick for Secretary of Defense. One of the questions looming over that is, can Trump's inner circle move on from some of the friction between Trump and DeSantis? Here to discuss that and many other things, Marielle Saiz. She is the Executive Vice President at the Political Consulting and Public Affairs group known as SKDK, very powerful here in Washington. She's also former White House Director of Broadcast Media. And Aaron Perini, strategist at the political consulting firm Axiom Strategies, former Communications Director for the pro-DeSantis super PAC Never Back Down. So, Aaron, let me start with you, who joins us via Zoom. Your thoughts on Governor DeSantis, where he is, where he might be, and how he should navigate the future.
Ultimately, it's going to be up to Donald Trump whether he remains with Pete Hegseth, which all indications are at this point he will. If we begin to delve into the hypothetical about possibly Governor Ron DeSantis, given the reporting, it's really going to be up to Governor DeSantis. He still has 2 years left in his term. As governor, he will be term limited, so there is an opportunity to consider what would be next for him. He does have a military background. After 9/11, he enlisted and he served. He served as a JAG attorney and deployed to Iraq in 2006 with SEAL Team 1. He understands what active military engagement looks like, and he's been serving his country since. He's been the executive leader of the state of Florida. He's got an incredible resume, really, when it comes to possibly even being considered for the Secretary of Defense position. But at this point, it's all hypothetical because, as of right now, Donald Trump's standing by Pete Hegseth.
Sure, I agree with everything you just said. But just to add to that, Aaron, if the Governor DeSantis, as he inevitably would, calculates his political future, standing behind the podium at the Pentagon on a regular basis would considerably jet fuel and propel any ambitions he might have in 2028.
I don't think that Ron DeSantis would consider the first notion of becoming the Secretary at the Department of Defense to be about his political future and using that podium to get there. First and foremost, I do have to say that man would be considering serving the president and serving at the Department of Defense. It's true, though. It would be some level of political calculus for any individual who wants to go and maybe run for president again. And he is term limited. So this is something that could absolutely keep him in the national conversation. And obviously, geopolitics is going to be a major portion of what is going on in the first Trump term, good Lord, the second portion of the Trump term, the second time around. So this would be a very big opportunity to stay incredibly relevant nationally.
Mariel, how do you assess not only Hegseth's path, but those who have been mentioned as possible successors should that path go off the rails?
Well, Major, the first thing that comes to mind is just the chaos that we're seeing with this entire process, which is consistent with what we saw in the first Trump administration. And, speaks to a lot of the issues we've seen with this transition, including not properly vetting or vetting at all some of these nominees before they're announced. And when you think about the Department of Defense, we're talking about the largest federal government agency, right, that is charged with the serious work of securing America and our military readiness. And I think a lot of Americans are looking at this drama and thinking, is this really the best that we can do for the men and women in the armed services and for the civilians that support them? And so I think what Senate Republicans are really grappling with right now is that question. And so, we've seen Joni Ernst and others have serious concerns. I think the path here is very, very difficult for Hegseth. And the longer this goes on, right? We still have a month until inauguration. Right. The longer this goes on, the more political capital they have to expend, the harder it's going to be.
And it's also a management question, and I don't think even Hegseth has gotten to that layer of questioning. It's the largest bureaucracy in the federal government. It has many different interlocking and sometimes competing factions within it. It's hard to get a feel for the building. It's hard to get a feel for the global scope of the U.S. military. That's a management question. He's dealing with accusations about his personal conduct. We're going to get to a management conversation eventually, maybe.
And I've got to think that Senate Republicans are really unhappy to have these conversations about such serious allegations, such deep flaws on day one, when we haven't even gotten to those questions.
Aaron, where do you come down on this management question? Because that is something that every defense secretary designee has to put his arms around. We don't have a her question there yet. Because Joni Ernst, we might, his or her arms around, but still, the management question is not a sidecar issue.
That's right. And Pete Hegseth has been leaning in aggressively toward the media. And this was kind of part of Donald Trump's calculus from what we can see when it came to selecting potential cabinet nominees. It meant that they were strong advocates in the media, not only for him, but for the message. And we've seen Pete be talking about, he just did a long interview with Megyn Kelly about what his leadership goals would be, that it's about readiness and that it's about returning to standards. He actually said he doesn't care about the gender of an individual in a role. It's about being able to meet the specific physical and whatever the standard is to be able to do that job within the military. We're starting to get those answers to those questions. It's just getting muddled up in the news, which is the bigger question right now as Pete begins these conversations on the Hill about his background and whether or not senators think he's the right fit for this DOD position.
Aaron Perini, Mariel Saez, thank you so very much. It's great to have you with us. President Biden pardoned his son, Hunter, earlier this week. I'm sure you heard about it. Now, some are asking him to consider doing the same for others who they feel also deserve clemency. More on that next. You're watching America Decide. Welcome back to America Decide. It's great to have you with us. President Biden is facing growing calls to issue more pardons following his decision to grant a sweeping pardon to his son, Hunter. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries is one of those advocates. He argues the president should, quote, pardon on a case-by-case basis the working-class Americans in the federal prison system whose lives have been ruined by unjustly aggressive prosecutions for nonviolent offenses, unquote. Jasmine Wright is a politics reporter at Notice. She co-wrote an article detailing calls from progressives and so-called clemency groups for Mr. Biden to issue many more pardons before leaving office. Jasmine, as always, great to see you.
Great to see you.
Remind our audience of some history here,
Sure.
because those who are advocating for more pardons don't hold Joe Biden, the senator, entirely responsible for federal laws written about crime in the 80s and 90s, but they don't let him off the hook, and they believe that history should inform his judgment and actions now, correct?
That's absolutely right. I think that one of the huge issues for Biden in the 2020 election, obviously he was successful, but one of those huge issues was his actions writing that crime bill, participating in it, talking about it favorably for years after it was put in place. People who feel that that crime bill was instrumental in creating this federal prison policies that we have now, and kind of just the upwards numbers of people who exist in these prison systems. And so he dealt with that a lot in 2020 and basically tried to make amends for it, saying that he would be more favorable on crime, on harsh punishments, and trying to really turn the page from that. And so therefore, these people who we spoke to, not just on the left, although we spoke to people like Representative Ayanna Pressley, but folks in these clemency groups, one woman was actually granted clemency from former President Barack Obama. They want to see Biden live up to that, particularly because not everybody was okay with him pardoning Hunter Biden, but some folks were saying, yeah, you can pardon your husband. Pardon your son. We understand why, but you should pardon others, in part because he's only to this date pardoned 25 people so far, really falling far below when it comes to him and his predecessors.
So how many numbers, what are the numbers we're talking about, the advocates look at as the potential pool of those who might, from their vantage point, either qualify for clemency or full pardons?
Yeah, so the number that was thrown around was about 10,000. Now, that's not the amount that they expect Joe Biden to pardon. Maybe some of those people won't be pardoned at all, but certainly it's in the thousands, scores and scores of people who they feel that have committed lower-level crimes. Of course, we're talking about federal imprisonment, not state, because the president
can't do anything about that.
Right, but for people within the federal custody system, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of people who people believe deserve pardons because of some of these lower level offenses, particularly like weed offenses that don't have any crime attached to it or things like that. And so that's who they want to see Biden really enact pardons for. Now, to their credit, the White House, in defending this pardon earlier in the week, said that we should be expecting more. But the question is how many more? And people are really focused on what number of folks Biden will move forward with.
And to this history question, the clemency advocates say in many cases, or certainly in some noticeable cases, people are in the federal prison system for associated crimes, meaning a weed violation with something else, neither of which were nonviolent, but they're still in the federal prison system for a very long time.
Sure. Yeah, there are so many different classifications of why people are within the federal imprisonment system, in part because of the rules put in place by Joe Biden, they believe, because of the ways that nonviolent drug crimes were stacked up, the 3 strikes rule, certain things that have been decriminalized or taken off the books by various presidents. Sure, really evaluated, but still some people remain in prison because of them. And so these are the folks who they want the White House to take a real clear look at, really trying to show, or really trying to push Biden to show that he is following with what he said he would do in 2020, was really look at what laws are on the books and try to create some sort of equality and justice for folks who people believe have been robbed of that equality and justice.
Jasmine Wright with Notice. Chris, thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Senator Bernie Sanders weighing in on Robert F. Kennedy Jr., what the Vermont senator had to say about Kennedy's plan to, quote, make America healthy again. That's next. You're watching America Decides.
In America, it is no secret to anybody that we have a major obesity epidemic as well as an epidemic in diabetes. They are both directly related, and they are both getting worse.
It's Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders earlier today on Capitol Hill discussing what he and others perceive to be as a health crisis in America. Sanders also, interestingly, called out the Food and Drug Administration for failing to do more to prevent it, or at least slow it. Sanders also spoke to CBS News on President-elect Trump's pick to run the Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
From what I've not talked to Mr. Kennedy in a number of years, actually. I think what he is saying about the food industry is exactly correct.
CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand, who interviewed Senator Sanders, joins us now. What else did the senator tell you, Natalie, about RFK Jr.?
Major, good to be with you. Well, Senator Sanders, as chair of the HELP committee, has really sounded the alarm on ultra-processed foods and the food and beverage industry, drawing comparisons to the fight against big tobacco decades ago. Interestingly enough, RFK Jr. has also talked a lot about food policy, additives, taking on the food industry. That's something part of his platform. It's taken off online with the Make America Healthy Again movement. So I asked Senator Sanders if that's an area where he could potentially work with the Trump administration if RFK Jr. is confirmed.
I think you have a food industry concerned about their profits, could care less about the health of the American people. I think they have to be taken on. I think, on the other hand, when Mr. Kennedy talks about taking fluoride out of our water system, I think what the scientific community will tell you that would be a disaster in terms of dental health in this country. His views on vaccine are very wrong in so many ways. So we will see how the process unfolds. So I think what he's saying about the food industry makes sense to me. A lot of other things that he's saying are extremely dangerous.
So I tried to press Senator Sanders on if he's made up his mind about President-elect Trump's health picks, how he's preparing for the confirmation process ahead. Take a listen.
We are preparing. We're going to be prepared to ask the right questions. And it's not only the confirmation hearings, it will be discussions that we have behind closed doors as well.
At this point, have you made up your mind, or you're going to go through the process? Any other health-related, as the chair of HELP, are there any other health-related picks, agency picks, that you're concerned about?
Well, I think I know Kennedy somewhat over the years. I do not know his other picks, so I'm going to have to sit down and talk with him. The other thing I think that's important is Trump over the years, and Kennedy himself, has talked about as a health problem the fact that we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. And if I'm not mistaken, Kennedy has talked about the need for Americans not to pay more than the people in other countries. I think that's exactly right. And I hope Trump keeps his word in terms of going forward in something that he has talked about for years, substantially lowering the cost of prescription drugs in this country.
Major, as you know, though, the political reality going into next year is Republicans will have a 53-seat majority in the U.S. Senate. That is political leverage for them to get some of their big priorities and cabinet picks approved, Major.
Leverage indeed. Natalie Brand, very good interview. Thank you so very much. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report, that starts right now.